It's starting.
Okay.
It's taking time to start. Let me check on YouTube.
Okay. Chinmay, are you still there? Hello, Chinmay, are you still there? Hello. Okay. Got it. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So it turns out we are already live. I didn't realize that. So thank you for giving me a chance to talk at the PDC meetup. I'll be talking on building front-end heavy apps with Rails 6 and Webpacker. My name is Prathamesh Sonpatki. I work at Last9. My Twitter handle is this. I write blogs on this my blog, Prathamesh.tech. I write about Ruby, Ruby on Rails, Webpacker, JavaScript, and other stuff. So if you want to be updated with my blogs, you can subscribe to my mailing list. So today our agenda is that we are going to talk about Rails and JavaScript relationship from the very start and what Webpacker brings to the table for a Rails developer. We are not going to talk about why Webpack or Webpacker is a good choice for you because that issue is already solved. and the Rails team has given their vote in favor of Webpacker. So we are not going to talk about that, but we are definitely going to talk about how to use Webpacker with a new Rails application, or what are the problems that people face when they are using Webpacker with an existing application. And we are going to look at how to configure and customize Webpacker as per our needs. So that's the agenda for today. As per the format of this session, during like whenever I finish a particular section, I will go back to the comment section and I will check if there are any comments or questions from all of you and try to answer those. So if you have any question during my any of the slide, just post it on the feed and I'll take a look at those. Thank you. So most of you, I assume, are aware of what Ruby on Rails is, or most of you have used Ruby on Rails in your work. It's a full stack web framework. It supports all the layers of a particular web framework. Its main advantage is that it has a convention over configuration for different kind of features. So out of the box experience of a Rails app means that you get a lot of things that are already enabled and already working that you don't want to configure for every new application that you're building. For example, the database support comes out of the box. The Postgres, MySQL, and SQL database are supported out of the box. In recent versions, you also have support for storage in S3 and other storage, cloud storage services, and so on. So one of the motto of the Rails framework is that look at all the things that you don't want to do, you don't have to do every time. Look at all the things that are already being done for you by default by the framework. And this is the code by DHH, the author of Ruby on Rails, that look at all the things that I'm not doing, right? I'm focusing on my application logic instead of configuring different parameters for a service or configuring different services or different tools that I'm using. So that is one of the main idea behind Ruby on Rails. And we will see how Ruby on Rails approach JavaScript to make sure that we don't have to configure hundreds of things to write our JavaScript application. So this is one of the best thing that is about Rails, is that out of the box you get most of the things already working that are very common for a web application. So initially, when Ruby on Rails was introduced, it was, I think, way back in 2005 or 6. At that time, the JavaScript tools and community was not as progressive as it is today. So you didn't have a package manager, you didn't have tools like Webpack, Browserify, and so on. And the way of writing JavaScript code was a lot different at that time. Even I don't think there were many apps which were very JavaScript centric apps that compared to today. But at that time, around 2007, Rails introduced a tool called as Assets Pipeline, which was also known as Sprockets. So this tool was a Ruby gem, a Ruby library. It supported minification and concatenation of the assets. It supported the combining of your JavaScript files in a single file so that it can be served for production. Also, it supported images, fonts, and CSS. It also slowly over the years, it also supported using NPM packages, using Yarn or the NPM package manager for dependency management. Later on, support was also added for source maps and ES6 during the past few years. But there are also some philosophical differences between how the asset pipeline was developed and how today's JavaScript ecosystem works. One of the main issue I think for this was that when the asset pipeline was developed, there was no benchmark in the JavaScript ecosystem for a bundler kind of a tool. So asset pipeline was mostly developed as a Ruby wrapper over JavaScript. But over the years, the JavaScript ecosystem evolved a lot, and now we have different package managers like npm yarn. We have tons of transpilers like babel and TypeScript and so on. There were also big differences in terms of how the scope was, like the scope of your code was exposed to the browser For example, we know that for any JavaScript to work in browser, it needs to be available to the browser. And one of the approach that Asset Pipeline took was exposing all the JavaScript code as globals, which were available on the window object in the browser. So because of that, the order of loading your JavaScript code mattered a lot. And in terms of if you look at the JavaScript ecosystem during last few years, the focus is on building modules and then letting your build tool combine those modules and make them available to the browser. So there were some fundamental differences between the JavaScript ecosystem and the Rails approach of handling JavaScript. And there, as we already know, like there are tons of changes that happen to the JavaScript ecosystem every day. We have a lot of frameworks, we have a lot of tools, a lot of libraries. There is something new that always happens, right? And because of that, Rails Asset Pipeline had to always catch up with the JavaScript ecosystem, which was not always possible. Also, one more important factor is that I think during the initial days, there were not many apps which were JavaScript heavy apps. But these days, if we look at most of the applications that we build, we think about front end or the UI part as a first class citizen. We want to have a good, interactive, rich UI. And the only way to build such UI is build the like use the JavaScript tools that support building such kind of UI. And that's where the Rails way of using Asset Pipeline was kind of lacking. And that's when Rails team decided to basically embrace the JavaScript ecosystem by using Webpack. So I have finished the first section, so I'll just go back to the comment section and see if there are any comments. Okay, looks like there are no comments as of now, so we'll move on to the next section. One of the way people tackled this problem was they started building API only applications in Rails, and this was already supported by Rails. You can just start an app in API mode, which will not have any JavaScript support, any Vue support, and then you can build your front end app in any of the tool that you want. Like you can use React, AngularJS, TypeScript, or anything that you want. This approach is kind of okay. You can build two separate apps. You can have two separate teams working on the apps, but managing those two things is kind of is not very easy, right? So you have to maintain two code bases. You have to make sure that the releases are coordinated across the repositories, and you have to also make sure that the documentation is up to date and so on. So this approach worked in few cases, but also if Rails supported JavaScript tooling out of the box, people would have preferred that approach instead of building an API only application. So that's when Rails team sort of started exploring how we can embrace the modern JavaScript, and they came in with the approach where they started using Webpack. I think most of you might have heard about Webpack. So Webpack is basically a tool which does most of the tasks that are done by Rake and Bundler from Ruby ecosystem. So for example, using Rake, we can write certain tasks, and using Bundler takes care of managing our dependencies. So Webpack kind of does all of this and much, much more. So it can minify the assets, it can concatenate the assets, it can combine all the assets into a single file and then expose it to the browser so that browser can understand the JavaScript code. It can also transform the code. So let's say you're writing ES6 or ES7 code, then using Babel or any other transpilers, Webpack can basically convert your code so that it is understood by all the browsers. And one of the most important thing is that it is battle tested. A lot of people already use it in the JavaScript ecosystem, and that's why if you choose a tool which is kind of adopted by a lot of people, there are high chances that you can succeed by using that tool in building your application. So and this was also evident by looking at the 2017 JavaScript State of the Art survey. So during that time, Rails introduced Webpacker in the ecosystem. So during that time, as you can see here, like most of the people were already using Webpack, and they were willing to use it again, right? So it was a clear winner. If you look at all the tools, all the build tools like Webpack in the JavaScript ecosystem, Webpack was the clear winner during that time, and that's why Rails team decided to choose it as the way of managing JavaScript code in the new Rails application. So Webpack is a JavaScript library, right, that we can include in our application. But here we are talking about Webpacker. So it's a Ruby wrapper for using Webpack, but it is also, I have added explicitly plus plus here, so that because later on we will see how it is kind of not just the Ruby wrapper, but something else as well. So it's a wrapper over the Webpack JavaScript library, which we can use in our Rails applications. At least as of now, it is coupled tightly with the Rails application. So you cannot use it with any of the other web frameworks that are there in the Ruby ecosystem. What it tries to do is it tries to bring the same convention over configuration approach to JavaScript that we already have in our Ruby code. So if you use or heard about Webpack before, you might have come across a lot of posts on Stack Overflow or a lot of ranting on Twitter that you have to configure hundreds of things to make Webpack work. Like a lot of people get confused about how much configuration I need to do to get a single page working, or if a new version of Webpack comes, then I have to change some of my configuration and then make my existing app work. So what Webpacker tries to do is it tries to give you a default set of configuration so that you can focus on developing your application instead of worrying about, oh, I want to change this key to true, or oh, I want to add this particular loader so that my CSS file will get precompiled, and so on. And it provides a Rails way of using Webpack. So it provides certain helpers that can expose our compiled assets into our views and so on. So we'll see some of the examples of that when I show you the code demo. But essentially, that's what Webpacker tries to do. It provides Rails way for using Webpack, which is what we are used to as Rails developers. Let's again go back to the comment section. Any questions so far? All right. So we'll come back here. So these are all the features that Webpacker supports. It has support for almost the latest version of Webpack. It supports ES6, so you can write the JavaScript code in ES6. It will get it will get transpiled to the normal JavaScript. You can use multiple entry points. It supports the advanced JavaScript features such as code splitting, post CSS, and so on. It also has support for images and fonts. It also has supports for compiling these style sheets. So Rails recommends that you use Webpacker only for managing JavaScript files, but it also has support for supporting other types of assets like images, fonts, and CSS. And actually, we'll see later how it is more intuitive to just switch completely to Webpacker instead of using a split approach where you use Webpacker just to manage JavaScript and sprockets to manage the CSS and images. It has support for source maps, minification of assets, which is kind of very standard. Every build tool almost supports it. You can use CDNs, JavaScript CDNs with Webpack and Webpacker. It also has support for Rails view helpers, which is what mostly we need. From the Rails application point of view, that we should be able to expose our JavaScript code to our views. We should be able to pass data around, and it is also very extensible and configurable. So it comes with a default set of configuration, which are the conventions. But if you want, you can extend it to do other things. Like you can basically override the default configuration that Webpack provides, and if you want to have some custom packages or custom tools in your build pipeline, that is also possible to configure. So one of the things that happens generally when you use Webpack is, as I discussed earlier, you have to configure tens of hundreds of things, right? So in case of Rails, when we install the Webpacker, Then we get a file, a webpacker.yaml, where we have to configure certain where certain things are already configured, right? And some of the things are entry points location. So for example, this is the location where Webpack will start looking for files which it needs to compile. Then where to output the compiled bundle. So that is also configurable, and whether to output CSS or not, that is also possible to configure. So what we will do right now is that we'll just go straight to the app, a sample app that I have built on Rails 6, which already uses Webpacker, and I will explain you the certain aspects of the code. So this is the app that I have already built on Rails 6. Rails 6, if you create a new Rails 6 app, Webpacker comes by default, and it gets installed also by default. But just to show you what exactly happens when Webpacker gets installed, I'll try to install it again. So let's see what all steps happen when we install Webpacker. So the first thing that happens is it installs this webpacker.yaml file. One of the important thing about this file is that this file is used by Ruby component of Webpacker as well as JavaScript component of Webpacker. So if you look at the architecture of the Webpacker Gem, it has two components. There is a Ruby wrapper and there is a JavaScript package, which acts as a bridge between Webpack and your Rails application. So this is the file that contains most of the configuration, and it is consumed by both Rails and Ruby. I will just overwrite it as of now. I don't think there will be any change. Apart from that, Webpacker creates all of these configuration files. If you are a Rails developer, you might notice that we have here three separate files, one for development, one for environment, and one for production. As you know, and there is also test.js as well. So as you know, in Rails applications, we have these environment specific files in our Ruby code as well, right? We have config environments, development.rb, production.rb, and so on. Similarly, we have these environment specific files for Webpack, and also there are some other files related to Babel, PostCSS, and so on. Important thing is that it also installs some of the JavaScript packages that are by default needed for Webpacker, and the most important package is this Rails Webpacker. So when I talked about a Ruby wrapper, I mentioned that it's not just Ruby wrapper; it's also certain other things, and this is that other thing, which is the JavaScript package, which also acts as a bridge between Webpack and Rails application. So it installs all of these packages using Yarn, and by the end of it, what we have is we have the complete app, which is ready to serve our Webpack assets. So let's try to just see what happens. We'll just start the Rails app. Let's just make sure that we have some route. So we'll go here. We'll define one simple controller. And right now, this doesn't render anything. We'll just see what happens. What is the output of this application? That's the only thing that we want to test. So when I run this app, oh, it's already done. Sorry, let's stop it. Run it again. Now you can see that here in the output, it is saying that Webpacker compiling. So if you use the asset pipeline before, you must have noticed that the whenever we change any of the asset during development, it gets compiled at the same time, right? And similar thing happens when we use Webpacker as well. So what happens is that when the request is being processed, then Rails basically looks at your file system. If you have changed any of the JavaScript file, it will compile it again, and then you just have to make sure that you refresh the browser and you will see the updated code. So this is how it compiles all the JavaScript. Right now we don't have any JavaScript as such, right? This is the brand new application that we created, but it has compiled the application JS pack. So if you compare it with the asset pipeline, it is almost the same file as the app assets application.js. But here, instead of reading that file from app assets, Rails is reading it from app JavaScript. So let's look at the JavaScript directory. So this app JavaScript directory is the new home for our Webpacker related code. And this is where we will add all our JavaScript code that we want Webpacker to compile. But where it is configured, right? So I mentioned about the webpacker.yaml file earlier. And if we look at this webpacker.yaml file, here we can find that all the default settings are configured here already. So the source path where the Webpack will look for the files to compile is app JavaScript. The source entry path is the directory. So Rails in Rails conventions, we are calling it as packs. In app JavaScript, if you notice, there is a directory called as packs, where the packs entry points for our Webpack code will be present. So if we compare with our asset pipeline, we had files like app assets, JavaScripts, application.js, admin.js, and so on. Here we have similar concept called as packs. So we have app JavaScript packs, application.js, we can add a admin.js, we can add a settings.js, and so on. But one of the most important thing is that this folder should only have files which are entry points for Webpack, and your actual JavaScript code should not be present in this directory. This mistake happens a lot of times when we are migrating from our existing Rails 5 application to Rails 6. We copy everything from the asset pipeline into the packs directory. But because this is the entry point for Webpack to start compiling, this should not be the home for all your JavaScript code. This should be the home only for entry points, and then the rest of the JavaScript code should be outside of this folder. So in the webpacker.yaml, we also have certain file extensions. So let's say I want my JPEG file to be compiled, PNG file to be compiled, or any other new extension that I want to add. All of this configuration can be done here. I also have environment specific settings. In development, we can run Webpack dev server. We will see a demo of it shortly. But I can configure the settings for dev server here. Then I have some production specific settings which are useful for making sure that the production build is optimized for performance. So I can check, I can like toggle some of these settings. I can introduce new plugins here to make sure that my production build is working correctly. So this file basically has all the settings related to the path, the output path, and what kind of extensions the Webpack will compile, and so on. Any questions so far? Yeah. So Vishal has a question about we already have development and production.js. What is the use of environment.js? So that's a very good question, Vishal. So what happens is that the development, production, and test.js, these files use the environment.js as base, and they expose and change some of the configuration which are specific to that particular environment. So let's say in development mode, you want to use a yarn package, which is to be only used in development mode, right? So you can do that in the development.js so that other environments are not affected by that change. And environment.js will have all the base configuration. So we will see that a bit later, but that's a good question. So basically the answer to that question is the environment specific things go into environment specific files, and common settings go into environment.js. So that's where we have almost finished. Yeah. Pratik has a question. If you are building Rails app today, should we go with Webpacker or with Rails views? Uh, it depends on what exactly your app is. So if you are building a JavaScript heavy app, I would highly recommend going with Webpacker directly with one of the integration that it provides with React or Angular or Vue, instead of going with Rails views. If you are building an app which is not very JavaScript heavy, let's say you are building a portal or a admin kind of interface where most of the interactions are CRUD interactions, at that time you can go with Rails views. But you cannot go without Webpacker, at least in Rails 6, because Rails 6 comes by default with Webpacker. You have a choice of using it or not using it, but it is always there. If you install a new Rails 6 app, you can always skip it at the time of creating the Rails app, but by default it is always there. Vishal has a follow-up question. You mean it will have default config for app? Yes, it will have a default config for app, and we'll come back to it a bit later in next few minutes. And I will show you what is that default config and how to basically change it if needed, right? So this was all about webpacker.yaml file. Most important point to remember is that you cannot use any ERB code in this file, because this file is also read by the JavaScript component of Webpacker. So this file has to be YAML. Most of these settings, at least the default settings, you don't have to change, because this is where the Rails convention over configuration aspect comes into the picture. We already know that there are certain paths where the Webpacker will look for files, and the output will be present in the public folder and so on. So this is already set. So you don't have to do a lot of changes in this configuration. One of the option that can be changed is resolved paths. So basically, the default path where Webpacker looks for files is app JavaScript packs, but here you can also add certain other paths. So let's say your app is a legacy app which has some code in vendor assets, and then you can add it here. Or let's say you want to add engine specific path, right? Right, you're using a Rails engine and you want to make sure that the assets from that Rails engine also get into the precompiled path. You can add it here. So I think most of the times this is the only setting or some of the static assets extension that you want to configure, but rest of this file is same. You don't want to change it all the time. All right, so let's move on to the next section. We have discussed about the webpacker.yaml file, but configuring Webpack is much more than that, right? If you use just Webpack before, if you're a JavaScript developer and you use Webpack, then you might have noticed that you can use certain speed optimization plugins, or let's say you want to use certain loaders that are not supported by Webpacker or by default by Webpack, then that is possible. Basically, Webpack has a philosophy where you are allowed to customize and configure each and everything that is possible, right? That is one of the design aspects of Webpack, that it is highly customizable and highly configurable. And Webpacker also allows us to do the same thing. So it comes with a default JavaScript configuration in terms of Rails Webpacker npm package. So when we installed Webpacker, we saw that it also installed the Rails Webpacker package, and this is where all the default configuration is present. And when Prasad asked us about the Vishal asked us about the development.js and environment.js. That file is basically used to load this default JavaScript configuration. So what are some of the use cases that somebody needs to do to configure this package? Is basically you have some legacy jQuery plugins in your application that you want to expose to Webpack, because as we discussed, the design philosophy of Webpack and most of the other JavaScript build tools is that nothing is exposed as global, right? We have to import every package in the file where we want to use it, and that file will only have access to that particular package. But in case of asset pipeline, when we include jQuery Rails in the application.js, in every other file, the jQuery variable is automatically available because it is exposed on window, right? On the browser's window object. So let's say you're migrating that kind of code to Webpacker. You want to expose those global variables so that all the Webpacker code doesn't have to worry about importing it. Or let's say you want to export certain environment variables from Ruby to JavaScript. That is also possible using Webpacker. Let's say you want to customize certain loaders, like you want to support more file extensions. You want to compile one type of file into some other type of output. So to customize those, you have to configure the JavaScript environment of Webpacker. So this API for configuring the JavaScript JavaScript configuration is not very well documented, and we have to actually refer to the source code of the configuration object to see what kind of keys are supported. There is some documentation on this link. I'll share the slides later so you can take a look at this link. But the API is not very well documented or very well designed right now. But still, we will see one example of that, how to configure it. But before that, we will just take a look at all the JavaScript files. And these files are present in the config webpack directory. If we look at the, let's start with development.js, right? So we can see that the most important thing is it has defined the environment as development. Then it is loading the default settings from the environment file, and then it is exposing it to the exposing it as the default package of this particular development.js file. And if we take a look at production.js, it is also doing the same thing. The only difference is that the environment is production, and in test also the environment is test, rest of the things are same. So Vishal, your question is answered here, I think. As you can see, all those files have certain environment related settings, and they're just including rest of the settings from environment.js. And here we can see that we are getting the default environment from Rails Webpacker. So here Rails Webpacker exposes the environment, which we use by default here. But if you want to customize that environment and do certain things, that is also possible. We'll see a small example of that. The example that we will see is about exposing the jQuery dollar variable to the window. So I'll just remove all the code and go to jQuery resolve branch, and I can see here that what I have done is I have fetched the environment from Rails Webpacker package. My use case is that I want to expose the jQuery dollar variable to the browser window so that I don't want to do import jQuery or require jQuery in every of the files, right? My code depends on that. So to do that, what I do is the object that I fetch from the Rails Webpacker package, I annotate it, I append the jQuery plugin, I change the loaders so that window.dollar will be available. And then at the end, I again do module exports is equal to environment. So basically what our code initially was that we had this, right? But because we can access the environment object that comes from Webpacker, we can also modify it like this. This is how you can basically change the environment object, add more plugins, add more loaders, or customize existing loaders, and then expose the object again at the end so that all the environments will be able to use it. Right? So this is how, this is one of the example. You can also add certain speed measurement plugins, which is very common, or you can add .env yarn package so that you expose your environment variables which are stored in .env file to the JavaScript process. That is also possible. So this was about customizing the actual JavaScript configuration of the Webpacker. And earlier what we saw Webpacker.yaml was mostly about what data or what files Webpacker should look at to configure. But here we are actually configuring Webpacker for certain use cases. Let's see if we have any questions. Yeah, we have one question from Josefa. Does Webpacker removes a dependency of asset pipeline? If yes, how can we migrate the current assets to Webpack architecture? I'll come back to this a bit later. Webpack removes dependency of asset pipeline. Yes, definitely. And I'll come back to the migration part a bit later in the talk. All right. Moving on. Let's talk about some of the integrations that Webpacker supports out of the box. So it supports all of the most popular JavaScript libraries and frameworks. It supports React, Vue, Elm, Stimulus, Svelte, TypeScript, and a lot more things. So when I talk about integrations, what I mean is that you can create a React app using Webpacker, you can create an Angular app using Webpacker, you can create a Elm app using Webpacker very easily, because these integrations are supported out of the box. You just have to run a particular command, and you get a scaffold basically. So if you are a Rails developer, you must have used scaffold in your work for generating default templates, right? So when you do Rails scaffold controller, you get a default controller. Similarly, when you do Rails Webpacker React, you will get a scaffold of a React app, or you will get a scaffold of a Elm app. So what we will do is we'll also do a scaffold, but we'll do Svelte. So I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Let's see its status. Yeah, there is nothing. So we'll go to Svelte. Remove those files. And then I'll go back to Svelte, and then so what I want to do here is that I want to install the Svelte app. So I want to install the Svelte library and start using it. So let's do Rails Webpacker install. This was the command that we used to install Webpacker, but now we will use it to install Svelte. Let's see if it works. If it doesn't, I have already installed it, but looks like it worked. What it did was it added a loader for Svelte.js. Then it added that loader to the environment.js, so that Webpacker knows how to transfile the Svelte files to JavaScript files, and then it installed the required yarn packages, right? And it made our app ready to use Svelte. So if we do this same for React, it will install React, and it will install React related packages and make our app ready for using React. So this is one of the advantage of Webpacker, is that most of the integrations come out of the box that are very popular and widely used. So we just have to run the generator, and we get all the packages, all the like there is no chance that you will miss something, right? So let's say I'm using React and there are 10 packages, and I want to follow certain tutorial to make sure that I include all those 10 packages and so on. But here, when I just run a particular command, all the default dependencies are installed automatically. I don't have to remember about it. So when we install the Svelte.js Svelte.js application, then what happened was, let's ignore this React for now. Let's also ignore this. Let's also ignore this. Let's also ignore this. Let's also ignore this. All right. So when I installed Svelte, what happened was, let's go to our app JavaScript directory, and let's see what happened here, right? So what Webpacker did was, it created this file app.svelte, and it had some default code, which is the scaffolding code. It added this particular pack called as hello svelte.js. So basically the pack means, as we discussed earlier, this will be the file that will be compiled by Webpacker, and we have to use this file in our Rails view layouts. So initially we only had application.js, but when we installed Svelte, it also created this hello svelte.js. Let's see the content. It does import our app.svelte file, and then it just mounts the app on the document. Now, if we want to use this particular file in our views, we have to include this using the JavaScript pack tag. So that needs to happen in our layouts. So as most of you are already aware of Rails, you are aware of layouts and how the layouts work. So in the case of asset pipeline, we had JavaScript link tag. Similarly, we have here JavaScript pack tag for including the web packs into our HTML, and we can do that using Hello Svelte. So this will make sure that Webpacker will compile the Hello Svelte pack. It will import all the code that the pack imports, like our application related code. It will pre-compile it, and it will basically give it to the browser so that we can see that code, right? So let's run this code, and if we look at our app.svelte file, it just has hello name, and I think we're passing the name as Svelte. So we should see hello Svelte when we run this app. So let's try to run it. Now, if you use asset pipeline, you already know that um, it takes care of pre-compilation by default using the asset precompile rake task. And Webpacker also annotates the same rake task, so you don't have to run two commands to precompile the asset pipeline assets and the Webpacker assets. It happens automatically. So when we just do Rails S in the development mode, Rails takes care of pre-compiling your assets during the request processing, and it just works out of the box. So now if I go to the localhost 3000, I see again similar output that we saw earlier about compiling the Webpacker. It compiles all the packs. One difference here is that I see the entry point Hello Svelte. Earlier there was only application entry point, but now there is one more entry point because we have added that file under app packs, app JavaScript packs, and here I can see Hello Svelte. So let's try to change this. So let's try to do this PDC Tech meetup, and we have to refresh the file, and it gets compiled again, and it refreshes, right? So but if you're a JavaScript developer, this is not cool. We are used to do this refresh in Ruby world, but in JavaScript world, we also have hot module replacement, right? And Webpack actually encourages using that in development. So you don't have to keep refreshing your page. And that support is also present in Webpacker. So let's try to use that. To use that, we have to run the Webpack dev server separately. So here you can see that I just did Rails S, right? So I did not use the Webpack. I did not run the Webpacker dev server separately, but now we will do that. And when we installed Webpacker, it created a file, a binary under the bin directory for the dev server. So we'll just start that. But before we start that, we have to also configure the hot module replacement, and that can be done in the Webpacker.yaml file. So we had seen the dev server related settings here, and as we can see, the dev server starts on port 3035, but HMR, which is the setting for hot module replacement, is by default false. I'll just turn it true, and I will start Webpack dev server. And we will also start Rails S so that our main HTML gets rendered. Here I can see this is compiled and so on. I will just refresh it, and this works. I'll go back to so let me add some content. I will add here hello Pratik. Thanks for asking questions. And when I refresh it, you can see here that I didn't have to refresh the browser, it just went, right? So we can use these kind of techniques which were not possible earlier with Rails, because um, uh, we were not using the native tools that the JavaScript ecosystem uses. But now here, with the introduction of Webpacker, which is a wrapper over Webpack, we can actually use all of those native tools in our Rails application, and then not just not just we don't have to use them as a separate JavaScript app, but inside Rails application, as we saw here. Like, we just have to change one setting. We just have to start the Webpack dev server separately, which is which the binary is already present in our application, because we installed Webpacker, and it just works out of the box. So let's try this again. And here we will see that it gets refreshed. So there are some other settings for the dev server as well, which we can configure. So this is kind of good thing about Webpacker, is that it exposes these kind of JavaScript good things in the JavaScript ecosystem to the Rails world. Like, you can actually use a lot of other things that the JavaScript developers use in their development workflow also, because you have the full power of Yarn, you have the full power of Webpack. You can basically do whatever you want to do, right? So this was the demo of using one of the integration that Webpacker supports, and some of the development tools that we can use. Let's see if we have any questions. Can you give commands to set up scaffold of React? I forgot to note it down. So Vishal, it is already documented on the Webpacker repo. I will share some of the resources at the end, so you can take a look at that. But the simple command is, let's run it, I think, basically. So it's Rails Webpacker install React, right? The default command is Rails Webpacker install, which installs Webpacker. But if you want to install any of the integration, then you just append it to the original command. So you do React, you do Elm, you do Vue, you do Stimulus, and it will install that particular integration. All right, let's go back to the presentation. So these were all the integrations that are supported by Webpacker out of the box. So what are, how are we doing on the time? Let's just take that. All right, we have 5 minutes. All right, so what Webpacker brings is that brings to the table is that you can basically develop a full-blown front-end app within a Rails application. You don't have to create two applications for managing your front-end and back-end. Your Rails app can have your front-end code as well, and you can use all the latest and greatest things from the JavaScript ecosystem. The advantage of that is you can have multiple developer teams working on the same repository. You don't have to worry about coordinated releases. You don't have to worry about managing two separate things. It's everything in the same repo. And the good thing is that you get the same experience of things working out of the box that you get using a Rails app with Webpack as well. You have the liberty of using everything in the JavaScript ecosystem, because you have the full freedom. You can customize the Webpack configuration, you can use any of the JavaScript packages and so on. And this is, I think, one of the best things about Webpacker, using Webpacker with Rails. What Rails recommends by default is, and again, this comes to the question that Joseph asked about the how to migrate the existing app to Webpacker. So what Rails recommends is that you use Webpacker to manage the JavaScript code, but let sprockets or asset pipeline manage the CSS and images and fonts. And one of the reason for that split approach is that managing the CSS, images, assets, fonts in Webpacker is kind of contrived, so it's not very straightforward. Actually, what happens is that Webpack wants everything as a JavaScript module. So if you want to use CSS and let Webpack compile CSS, you have to also include or import that CSS file in your JavaScript file. So that is kind of weird. Everything is a module, so you have to import everything as a module inside the pack, so that Webpack will compile it. And that's where DHH and the Rails team differs with the Webpack way of doing things. They say that let's use the asset pipeline for managing the CSS fonts and other things, because um, there is nothing much significant in terms of using Webpack for managing the CSS and other files. For JavaScript, definitely yes, because it gives you a lot of freedom to use and structure your JavaScript code. But in terms of CSS, maybe no. So Rails recommends that you use sprockets for managing CSS, but using CSS for Webpack, using CSS also in Webpacker pipeline is much better, because you don't have to worry about two separate things, and everything is inside Webpack and managed by Webpack. So my suggestion will be that you use Webpack for everything. If your app is JavaScript heavy app, if your app is not JavaScript heavy app, this probably doesn't apply to you. You can just keep using the same technique that you used earlier for managing JavaScript and CSS. In terms of migrating the legacy code bases, I will suggest that as much as possible, avoid it, because it may not work out in all the cases. You might have some legacy way of using JavaScript, which was completely different from the Webpack way. Like we discussed about asset pipeline, exposing everything as globals. It's not very easy to migrate that kind of code to the Webpack style of writing coding. What can be done is that the new code can be written in the Webpack style, and you can slowly rewrite the existing code or just get rid of it instead of worrying about migration. It also depends on your project size and what kind of bandwidth you have for the migration. But migration is not very straightforward. It depends on your code base and how you have structured your code. So I think that answers your question, Josefa. We'll just see if you have any questions. Will there be any additional tasks that we need to take care when deploying the app via Capistrano? I think this is excellent questions. Thanks for asking that. So no, the answer is definitely no. You don't have to worry about any of the extra tasks, because what Webpacker does is it annotates the existing Rails assets pre-compiled task, and it basically compiles the Webpacker assets also after compiling these Sprockets assets. The only thing that you want to make sure is that wherever you are compiling your assets, yarn has to be present on that machine, because Webpacker needs yarn, that is the dependency. If you don't have yarn installed there, then the yarn install step will fail, and the asset precompile step will fail. If you are using Heroku installs yarn by default for Rails 6 application, so nothing is needed there. But if you are deploying on Capistrano on AWS or DigitalOcean, just make sure that wherever you are compiling your assets, make sure that yarn is installed there. So for example, a lot of people use Docker these days, and while building the image only, they precompile the assets, right? So you have to make sure that whatever base OS that you are using, Ubuntu or Debian or CentOS, make sure that the Node.js and Yarn is installed on that OS, so that when you run the precompile step, it will succeed. So that's the only thing. But other than that, nothing is required. Rails assets precompile takes care of rest of the things. There is a question from Priyanka. How can we access environment variables in integrated frameworks with Webpacker? Like in separate React app, we define .env file and access it like process.env.variable name. So this is excellent question. I think this is possible using the approach of modifying the environment.js file. So in this file, what we can do is we can load the .env yarn package and let it read the .env file as you mentioned, and then expose the variables as process.node.env, whatever. So that is one of the use case actually of modifying this environment.js file, so that we can expose the environment variables. At the end of the talk, I will share some resources for that. I don't have the example ready as of now, but I've seen a lot of people doing that. So after the talk, I will share the resources about how to do that. But basically, we just have to modify this environment.js file and expose the environment variables. If there are no common environment variables that you need in all the environments, then obviously you will override the environment specific file, like you will override development.js or production.js. So that is as per your use case. Yeah, so that is all related to the presentation. Resources, if you are starting with new Rails 6 app, I would highly recommend just going through the Webpack guide, because just getting to know the basic philosophy that Webpack follows is very important in understanding the code and how it should be structured. Because if you're coming from the asset pipeline school, it is very different in terms of how the code is exposed, how it is packed, and most of the philosophical design decisions are completely opposite of each other. So understanding the Webpack way of doing things is important. So I'll recommend going through the getting started guide. And then there is a docs directory in the Webpacker repo under Rails or. So it has details about how to customize, how to configure, what are the default settings that comes with Webpacker and so on. And I have written few blog posts also on this topic, so you can take a look at that as well. I have written about how to get started with Webpacker and how to manage the packs. I have also written about the latest 5.0 release of Webpacker, so you can take a look at that. That's all from my side. I think we can take some last questions. So if you have any questions, please ask them. How are we doing on time? I think we just went ahead by 2-3 minutes. I don't think there are any questions. So, Chinmay, how do you want to proceed? Yeah, Vishal is asking. Yes, I will share it on the meetup page, and I will also tweet about it. The presentation is, I don't think the presentation is as useful as the commentary that happened along with the presentation, because that's where we sort of deep dive into the code base. Just looking at the slides may not be useful. So once I think the video is ready, I think that will be the best resource. But I'll share some of the yeah, I will share some of the resources and my slides on the meetup page. Yeah. So I think I'm done. Chinmay or any of the PDC team members, how to end this? Just, um, all right. I think I will just stop here. I think leave studio and then we'll stop. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. I'll share the resources and we can talk on Twitter if you want. So this is this is my Twitter handle, and you can see some of the resources on this page. And you can also send me email if required, and we can have a chat. Thank you.